So this morning, we'll talk about concrete cases, projects that are developing agroecology interventions, and we'll try to define those projects and what actions we can put in place. And for that, we thought, and we suggested a canvas that obviously needs to be adapted to each local context, and also to the defined objectives, what you decided to do nationally. And also it needs to be adapted in function of the priorities that you might have locally. This document, you can find it in the drive, and it's built with following the EAP template. You could just copy and paste and adapt it to each context. So this allows us to work more quickly and have a canvas and a set of ideas to start working from. So we see this AP template. We see summary objectives, definition of political priorities, also of the political impact it might have, and the domestic priorities there might be. We put the accent on the intervention logic. That means what are the key interventions? How can we draw them, and how can we implement them? The final, this is. So we developed this kind of tool to look while looking at what F2 is doing with Nature Africa when they're helping reserves to protect biodiversity in reserves and parks. So we took, and they also include peripheral agricultural land. So we looked into what they were doing there to adapt it. And there are some suggestions of agroecology in there, actually. Now I'll insist mainly on the main interventions in this document. So what are the interventions that are possible? So there is a list that we'll discuss. You will discuss again within the working groups. There are propositions where you can present them another way. You can identify other intervention proposition. That's just a canvas. But if you want to develop a project, a program in agroecology, the central element is to improve overall practices and propose innovation. So that means developing agroforestry, include fertility of the soils, deal with the pests, put in place organic farming, and so on. In this kind of intervention, it's recommended to have a multi-stakeholder approach with producers, researchers, NGOs, private sector. All of them work together and create innovative networks, innovation networks, and they can build together innovation and create living labs. This is the new form, the living lab. This is what we saw yesterday. It's the agroecology approach. It's the same idea, it's same kind of intervention, but really focusing on intervention and on scaling interventions and not just having experimentations. Another area is strengthen the innovation support service, trying to be more supportive of the local communities and farmers. It means reinforcing the advice, the services, and work in favor of collective actions. If you develop organic farming, you need to develop the capacities of the farmers, but also create value chains. So you need to work with all the people along the value chains. That also means having the input of small entrepreneurs. How can we support them? I mean, we're talking about farmers, but also people that transform produce or bring services to the farmers. So this is very linked to the startup world with incubators and so on. But this strengthening of the support service needs to be looking at people that are more facilitators rather than people that are telling you what to do. It's a new form of support. There is also the need to develop specific services. For instance, developing bioinputs in an agroecological agriculture, but also services that help a new kind of value chain with labels, new kind of labels, and so on. Within this framework, the use of digital tools is very useful, as we mentioned yesterday. We can put in place different tools that just work in favor of connectivity and how people can connect from one to another. Next, the third area is reinforcing value chains. Well, we need to develop markets and give access to markets so that the agroecological produces can be sold. And for that to happen, we need actions around circular economy, recycling, creating renewable energies, so value chains that are sustainable and responsible. But we also can have intervention around certifying produce. We mentioned that yesterday already. Certifying produce or processes. It could be participative certification or the creation of sustainable labels, ideas like that. But along those value chains, we can also have short ones for the marketing of produce from farmers in cities, but we can also have actions that are linked to the public procurement, to, for instance, give produces to schools, armies, prisons, and so on. We have quite a few of these in different countries to try and promote a certain type of agriculture and production. The fourth area that is important is the one of strengthening public policies to support agroecological transition to scale up. And for that to happen, you need actions to access national and local arenas so that people can change their mind around agroecology, talk about what's blocking, what solution we can put in place, how we can adapt it locally, and try to transform them into policy tools and instruments that will facilitate that transition. It is necessary to work within an environment that is favorable to agroecology. So we've identified a certain number of tools that are important. The standards are very important. Taxation is also very important, and subventions, funding, in particular, the kind of aid they send to Africa, so that farmers can buy intrants. There are multinational help, but we can also think about innovative financing. For instance, for startups that are working with a green kind of economy and in favor of agroecology, sorry. We've also identified actions that we consider as complementary. The ones I've presented before are absolutely necessary if you want to develop agroecology at a large scale. But we can also add to that complementary intervention in function of the countries and the priorities. Those interventions are more on the territorial approaches that are complementary to the agroecological approaches with landscape management, as F2 does, for instance, and that allow for a sustainable management of resources. And this works alongside local governance. And actually, F2 is including agroecology in their landscape management because they consider this works alongside with their project. We can also improve nutrition and health by valorizing the diversity with a better nutrition of rural population, by working with culture that have been forgotten, but have a lot of nutrition. But we can also look at the diets in urban areas to try to have access to diet that are more balanced and more diversified by using the produce of agroecology, which means that we need to educate consumers for that, so that they are aware that there can be a balanced and diverse diet based on fresh produce. Other kind of complementary intervention around research, we said that we needed to have agroecology that was open to innovation and that the margin for progress is enormous. We worked for decades and invested so much in the Green Revolution, but we didn't invest or hardly invest any money to try and develop method around agroecology. So the margin for progress is massive. And developing agroecology can mean developing research, national level, looking at processes, but also social processes, not just agroecological one, and look at actors and who can innovate, and having a pluridisciplinary approach and more systemic approach by having research that are participatory and action-based. And finally, one last complementary intervention is the training, academic and professional training. And some projects are looking at that. They say there's no future for agroecology if we don't train young people and professionals to know what to do. So these interventions are quite classic. There's no news, nothing new in there, because we've developed those kind of interventions in projects for decades. What's new is to analyze them looking at agroecology. There are 13 principles. Émile Frison reminded you of them. I'll just go over them very quickly because we'll have to use them again during the exercises, the workshops we'll do later on. So we need to have them in mind so that we know exactly what they cover and to know whether the intervention we are trying to work on is actually close to what we call agroecology or not. Because trying to fill in those 13 principles, we know it's more of an objective, but we need to be as close to that as possible. So the principle is that it's it goes around the reusing of resourcing. Recycling of resources is really important. You know, in the land, um, in the farm, for compost and so on, but also at the more bigger level, at the territory, to have a transfer from one area to another with, I don't know, recycling between urban areas and countryside area, with, for instance, the reuse of human excrements, for instance. There is also this question of elimination of external inputs, chemical inputs, limiting costs and favor to try and better the fertility of the soils. Another series of principles is around the health of the soils and how you deal with organic matter and trying to recreate biological activity within that soil. Also, the animal health, how we can improve the health and welfare of animals. Fifth principle is the biodiversity that allows us to preserve and both increase the performance of the biodiversity systems at the land, the farm, and the landscape level. Within that framework, the sixth one fits in there. It's the synergy among the elements of agroecosystems, so play on the agroecological process and how they interact within one another. And then the seventh one is the economic diversification, and not only genetical diversification, but also economic diversification. Then there is a series of criteria around the social impact and social dimension. So the co-creation of knowledge, including local and scientific knowledge, recognizing the diversity of type of diet-based and social values. That is the need to develop dignified and reliable livelihood, a principle around the connectivity in order to guarantee proximity and trust between producers and consumers, the different actors. First one is the governance of land, based on social justice with a local governance. We mentioned it with the landscape approach, and then a participation of all the actors locally to encourage social organization locally and also decentralized governance so that food systems can be managed better. So I presented the interventions, 8 of them, the principles on which we need to analyze these interventions and see whether we're close to those principles. And now we will be split into working group. Helen is going to split us into groups. Each group will work on one specific proposition that has been presented by a delegation. We will start by a presentation from that delegation. They will present what they're planning, and they will link it to the different interventions that I have mentioned. And then the end goal is to what are their main strengths, what are their weaknesses, and try to see whether there are other interventions that we could imagine, whether they could work or not, whether we should do them or not. So the idea is not to evaluate, but it's more a tool to think and debate between us. It's just having a real case so we can discuss and try to think how we build an intervention in agroecology.